Hello, everyone. I decided to change the title of my talk today, so it's not what is listed in the program, just to be maybe a little bit more substantial about the content of what I allude to when I talk about constituent power. But it does go in the same spirit of combining insights from several approaches to constituent power. So I am doing in a way what Andreas called yesterday the blurring of constituent and constituted powers. And I do not necessarily see a problem with that at all. And why? And it is not the defense of status quo. Because any radical constitutional project, like for example the one drafted by the Institute, does need a theory of constituent power that can reflect not only on the question of how the Constitution comes about, but also what happens when it is adopted. So in other words, a theory of constituent power is needed that explains how it does not cease to exist after the founding moment. So this discussion is relevant for any radical constitutional project. And this is what I want to reflect in this talk that I call constituent power as taking ownership. Now, constituent power is a modern concept that appeared to ground the legitimacy of a political order in the people, rather than God, tradition, or the will of the monarch. And it traces back from the monarchomacs and Calvinist jurists and their idea that magistrates are but servants of the people, and the theory of double sovereignty, popular sovereignty and monarchical sovereignty. But of course, the concept was first formulated by Abbé Sieyès during the French Revolution, when he claimed that the third estate has the constituent power which exists prior to everything and is the origin of everything, and its will is always legal. Sieyès' theory already bears the seed of what in contemporary theory is referred to as the paradox of constitutionalism or the paradox of democracy, namely the statement that the people are simultaneously above the law as its source, but also require forms of expression of their sovereignty, particularly procedures, institutions, or representatives. Sieyès solved the problem by arguing for an assembly of extraordinary representatives to exercise constituent power, thus formulating a representative theory of constituent power. Now, the history of the concept of constituent power in the 19th century, one could say, passes in the attempt to resolve this paradox of constitutionalism via abstractization of the subject of constituent power, and coming up with a monist theory of sovereignty. Jelinek, Gierke, Asmein, Karad-Malberg, you name it, any jurist talking about the concept, when answering the question of who the subject of constituent power is, so the subject of sovereignty, pursue a goal to theoretically justify the state rather than the people as the subject of sovereignty, and avoid any dualities, trying to form a monist theory. Any dualities like the sovereignty of the government versus the sovereignty of the people. In doing so, they rely on Sieyès' representative theory of constituent power, and condemn what they frame as Rousseau's mistaken view of popular sovereignty as social contract and a multitude's ability to form a state. The abstractization of the subject of constituent power consists in devising a trans-temporal view of the people with an enduring existence in history represented by the state. While this development obviously takes us away from the democratic origins of constituent power and democratic agency, and it was even explicitly formulated against this idea of democratic agency, there are elements, I argue, in this development that can be retained in a democratic theory of constituent power. And I think this duality or this development rather that we see in the 19th century is mirrored in the contemporary debate on constituent power today. There are two facets, two elements of the concept that, beginning with Sieyès' paradoxical formulation of the concept, keep dividing the debate on constituent power. On the one hand, there are theories of constituent power that emphasize its emancipatory facet, the right to resist and to become the authors of one's political system. And on the other hand, there are theories that focus on the facet of the tension between the political and the legal, the law and the will, and thus they don't only emphasize the revolutionary moment of constituent power, but ask about its existence within or alongside the constituted order. And the second debate does not necessarily have to include any democratic element. It can very well exist without the reflection on the any form of popular participation in constituent power. Now the first facet, the emancipatory constituent power, and the second one, the relationship between the political and the legal. The upside of the first facet is that it highlights the initial emancipatory promise of the idea of constituent power, and the idea of people gaining and extending their political engagement. But the downside of this first element of this first facet is that it does not have a theory of constituent power in a constituted order after any alternative constitution is adopted. It does not have a theory of this. Theories of constituent power of the multitude or only emphasize the revolutionary content of the concept, juxtaposing people as many to the people as one, claiming that the people as one only has this oppressive side. Now the issue of the relationship between the legal and the political within the concept of constituent power is usually resolved in the following way. Those theories, they claim that legal norms not only limit power, but they also generate power. And there is no sensible way of talking about the people governing themselves if there are no norms or procedures to facilitate the process of the expression of constituent power. This approach generally inherits this 19th century tradition of the abstractization of the subject of constituent power. And it opposes any attempt to assign the exercise of sovereignty to any concrete organ. And the existence of the people is not seen as opposed to, but in connection with the Constitution. Now, this upside of this second approach is the ability to theorize the people and the exercise of constituent power as part of a collective project that has duration and continuity, and that can evolve over time. And in particular, some theories that I group in the second approach emphasize the importance not only of the liberal understanding of constitution as limiting powers, but the importance of its symbolic significance in becoming a symbol of a sense of collective self and solidarity. And among other things, for example, it opens the possibility of theorizing the representation of future generations, which is discussed particularly in the context of the ecological crisis. The downside of this approach is that it can forget the emancipatory element of constituent power, and it usually has a minimal view of people's engagement with the constitutional norms, limiting the appearance of the people to eventual moments of constitutional amendment. But even theories that theorize increased participation in moments of constitution making, I think, do not go far enough. And I think that the problem of this debate is that it only focuses on constituent power during founding moments and discusses whether it happens through rupture, representation, or participation. But the concept of constituent power has so much more to offer, and it can comprise a larger scope of issues. Recently, it has been argued by Martin Leuven that constituent power does not have to be bound to moments of drafting or revising constitutions, that in fact constitutions can never fully regulate political power, and there's always a need of ad hoc decisions interpreting constitutional norms. But he ascribes it to the exercise of governmental powers, so this is not the direction I'm offering. However, taking this intuition that constituent power is not bound to constitutional beginnings or only revolutionary moments, I think a theory of constituent power is due that can express the full democratic potential of the concept. And that's what I would like to refer to constituent power as taking ownership. And by the idea of taking ownership, I mean that the core element of constituent power is not only the revolutionary moment, but the idea of the core element of constituent power, the core intuition from the beginning, is the people, the subject of constituent power, becoming what Spinoza calls sui juris, becoming in one's own right, becoming themselves. And understood as taking ownership of oneself and becoming sui juris, constituent power presupposes, in the Arendtian sense, that not everyone was there at the beginning of, at the founding moment, and that there are always new people who want to become part of the lasting project. And the people who were not there at the founding moment, which usually is pretty much everyone, can make political practices and norms their own and not impose on them from above, and thus partake in constituent power, which would make constituent power not an act but a continuous process with many expressions, not only drafting formal constitutions, even though the discussion of democratizing constitution making is very relevant to this point. It is also about civil disobedience and acts of resistance. And constituent power necessarily has to comprise a wider, broad array of practices. The heuristic value of the concept of constituent power, thus understood, can be turning the concept into a measure of how democratic a polity is. Now, any given regime does not have to have every single possible venue of expressing constituent power in this sense. But then we can talk about the degree of constituent power. And then we would shift the question from when constituent power should be exercised and who should exercise it, the limiting questions when talking about constituent power, but rather to how many expressions of constituent power there are in a system and how many venues there are available for people to make political life their own, thus take ownership of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have just two questions. One is, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of constituent power as a continuous process, right? But isn't there a logical implication that constituent power should result in a constitution, and constitution making should at some point create something that this constituent process should have an end, right? It's something that I'm struggling myself with, so that's why I'm asking, right? And the other thing is, you say that acts of resistance and disobedience should be also incorporated in the idea of constituent power as taking ownership. How then it differs, or how, what would be the relationship between this idea of constituent power and the concept of destituent power? Again, something that I'm thinking about, so I'm trying to get some inspiration.
Yeah, thank you. No, I don't think that constituent power has to be, it is part of constituent power to draft the constitution and to change the constituted order, but I don't think that this is its only moment. If we, constitutions are not exhaustive documents, so even if we're not talking about revising constitutional documents, there are always, you know, norms that are included in the constitution that need that are being all constantly being interpreted. If a constitution, what you know, the idea of constitutional norms is present in the society, and if we're talking about the civil society, you know, that is somehow that relates itself to the constitution, that it thinks that it has drafted, that there's a constant reflection going on any kind of level of what does it mean, what norms did we include and what norms we are being governed by. So there's always the constant act of interpretation of those norms, whether resulting in redrafting and revising the constitution or not resulting in revising the constitution. But in any form of engagement with the founding law, the founding norm, whatever form it takes, is the act of constituent power, to my mind. We can distinguish forms of expression of constituent power, one of them being drafting a whole new constitutional document, but I honestly don't believe that, or I think that
A specific question in this context. Would judicial review be an act of constituent power?
Or interpretation?
Yeah, it would be an act of constituent power. It wouldn't be an act of democratic constituent power. In theory, aspiring to formulate a democratic theory of constituent power, I would not include that, and I would argue against that, because it is not a form of democratic constituent power, but...
Well, now I'm surprised, or rather puzzled, because I thought you were arguing something else. But I first wanted to thank you for the talk, and also for the work which I have cited, and also for saying what you said today, because that's part of where I was headed, but I got bogged down in nationalist debates. So partly the reason I'm surprised is because partly what I heard is that you're saying, well, the people is many, is not located in one single organ or institution, but it's rather articulated through the entire institutional system, and it's actually not a formal or abstract thing, it's a living being, and whose life takes place in various places and through various practices and institutions, including constitutional interpretation, and therefore each of these phenomena could be understood as acts of constituent power or of the people ruling, of the governance of the people. But you seem to step back and say, except for the justices who are not the people. But why are they not people? Why are they not an expression of popular sovereignty? Why are they special or different?
No, I see your point. Well, this is exactly C.S.'s argument, who at the end of his life devises an argument of something alluding to constitutional review or juridical review of the Constitution, and precisely making this argument that the judges are the true representatives of the people.
Some of the representatives, right? Or one instance of representation.
Well, the argument against that would be that they're not, elected representatives. They're not elected by the people. So if they claim to be representatives of the people, it is not democratic representation in that sense. But
why should they be elected?
But the Constitution, right? The Constitution, which the people have approved or presumably authored or authorized in some way, includes a procedure for appointing or electing judges, whatever it is, and it might be elected. So in that sense, that rule itself is already authorized.
you are correct. I can see. I don't have an argument against that, and this can. Yeah, no, I see that.
Okay, I just wanted to maybe connect your talk to the previous one by Jan, to the question of binding yourself to something that happened long before your time, because this is also something you commented on. So are we... yeah, it's another question on the, whether we are continuously part of the constitution building process, or is it something that happened in the past and we need to have some sort of relationship to it, which brings us to the question of binding. I was just reminded of, and if you don't see any usefulness in this, just drop it. But I was reminded of the idea of Christianity, of Saint Thomas, who was told that, he sees and he believes, but, blessed are those who don't see and yet are bound. So there's actually maybe even like a privilege of those who weren't part of the actual event, who just believe, who just simply kind of trust that what happened and that it's good enough. And then this takes me to the Pauline Christianity. Paulus, of course, was not part of it at all, but then declared himself, oh, he's the actual apostle. And how Badiou then sees precisely that moment as the idea of how, fidelity to the event is actually what is needed. So I suppose I'm arguing against, or maybe just for the conversation's sakes, but maybe I'm arguing against the continuity of the process, simply in favor of precisely the idea of binding, which of course has religious connotations, but you is in this sense clearly almost on the religious side. But nevertheless, it's a possible route. Sorry for the length.
Yeah, no, 100%. That can, and it is an argument. That would be an argument of a minimal democratic intervention into constitutional process. That any form of consent, even if tacit, even not renewed consent, is already enough to bind yourself to legal norms. But I think the idea of the idea of democratic constituting power necessarily takes us into question the extent of the involvement. Constituting power, I think, as opposed to the concept of sovereignty, is a dynamic concept rather than a static concept that just can describe a state or effect of something. And being a dynamic concept, I think it requires theorizing the action, and then once we start thinking of constituting power in this dynamic sense, I don't see where there would need to be an artificial limit to who can partake and who cannot. So I think that's the natural movement of thinking along that line. So those would be two opposed views on, not even constituting popular sovereignty as consent versus constituting power as constant re-engagement.
Yes, Olga, I have a hypothetical question. How you will respond to someone who might claim that since the constituent power is a democratic concept, as you said a little bit, you alluded in the beginning of your presentation, any attempt to appropriate it for liberal or republican purposes might be in fact an attempt to de-democratize the concept and therefore to corrupt it in many particular ways. But you can say to de-radicalize it, to try to reform it, to domesticate it, to tame it. So how you will respond to that perspective, to that question? You will make the claim that no, the constituent power may also have liberal or republican aspects. You might want to have a mixed theory that reconciles all this without threatening the democratic core, or you might even say the democratic core of the constituent power is a little bit dangerous or can become dangerous. So let's try to moderate it with some other external principles or influences.
Well, it is. Yes, I think precisely the argument is a mixed form of. Exactly a mixed form of constituent power that tries to think of it in this that allows for, well, as a theory it is not I am not trying to formulate a normative theory of constituent power. I'm trying to stay true to the concept and express the content of the concept, which is contradictory. And I'm not trying to solve the contradictions. I'm trying to in a theoretical form, give explications to the content that the concept has and has accumulated.
Contradictory, you mean it's a contradictory democratic concept, so that the contradiction is within its democratic core, or it's a contradiction between a democratic dimension, a liberal dimension, and a republican dimension within the concept? So what kind of contradiction? Is a contradiction inherent to its democratic meaning, or it's a contradiction inherent to the multiplicity of its political meanings?
I don't understand this
division. This is a very important question. I have the same question. What is the contradiction? Because in your expose, it was not very contradictory. You need some kind of higher authority who would make laws and define such an authority. Then you measure which authority makes these laws a little better than the other. It's not contradictory.
No, this is.
It's a caricature. That's how naive people like me and Andreas understand.
You're trying to make a normative theory out of it. It is not a normative theory of constituent power. It is trying to say that constituent power expresses both the possibility of a violent revolution, and it also expresses the whatever you call a liberal idea of the people. But what I'm emphasizing about this, I don't know what liberalism means anymore after these 2 days, is not the limiting of powers of those people, but the symbolic dimension of this idea of the people, the symbolic dimension that is necessary to think of, beyond the revolutionary moment. That if you want to, I just don't think that any other concept than constituent power can express this dynamic feature of a lasting democratic project. I don't think there's any other concept. Democracy, sovereignty does not express this need to reactivate and this the active side of democratic subject. That's why there is no, the contradiction is between the possibility of the democratic subject turning against each other into a civil war, and between the need for this democratic subject to last over time. This is the contradiction. But there's no resolution to this contradiction, but there's no other concept that can express this than the constituent power, in my opinion.
I just wanted to add that your pedigree that you brought up was started with monarchomax. And I have doubts. I mean, no, certainly, historically speaking, you are right that they had similar ideas. But if you look at CES's phrasing, it obviously comes from philosophy, from the first philosophy, from theology, from Spinoza, from Duns Scotus. Sorry, it was turned off.
No, I'm saying that there is the parallel history of the concept, which is kind of important too. So I mentioned this. The theory starts with William of Auxerre and Duns Scotus. Then, of course, the very notion of constituent power. This is CES, but it's not simply monarchomax. And I think this is important because this is the definition of the paradox: the forming force and the formed force. You know, which, if you only go to monarchomax, you risk losing this.